On the shores of the Indian Ocean lies a country that contributed to many African nations' independence dreams. Traveling there was difficult, and getting there was often just the start of a grueling journey. Welcome to African Roots, brought to you by DW. In this podcast series, we discover how individuals from across Africa shaped the continent. I'm Kai Nebe.
And I'm Layla Johnson Salami.
Mozambique, Layla. I actually almost got there once. It's just across the border from South Africa.
Tropical beaches, Indian Ocean. I have heard the seafood there is amazing.
Yeah, it certainly is. And some of that food actually spills over into South Africa. I can't tell you, it's delicious. I actually sometimes wish African Roots were, a travel show where we could even flit from amazing nation to amazing nation. But today I actually want to tell you about someone who is equally amazing. And it's a woman from Mozambique.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie, Kai. A trip to Mozambique would not be bad. Anyway, let's get into it. Who are we talking about today?
So it's Josina Machel.
Machel, that does sound very familiar.
Yeah, Machel is actually a very famous name in Southern Africa, mostly because of Samora Machel, the fighter and the first president of Mozambique, who was president of Mozambique until his death in 1986. His second wife, Graça Machel, became the first woman to be the first lady of two different nations when she married Nelson Mandela, and she outlived both men. But today, it's about Josina Machel.
Her name of birth, or was she married to a Machel?
She was in fact married to Samora Machel. Josina Machel was Samora Machel's first wife, but Josina's story is really one of tragedy and, I guess, extreme determination.
Okay, tell me more.
So you know that idyllic country, Mozambique, with the cool name and those big white beaches? Well, the country wasn't always an ideal paradise. In fact, for much of the second half of the 20th century, Mozambique was known for war. And Josina Machel wanted to fight. Gunfire didn't discourage her. Josina Machel was determined to join the Mozambican liberation fighters living in exile in Tanzania and fighting against Portuguese colonialism.
And I'm sure, she lived in a society that discouraged women from fighting.
Yeah, indeed. But she also, interestingly, became one of the most important female fighters in Mozambican history. And I'd add, one who became famous for never really giving up. So Josina Machel was born Josina Abiata Mutemba in 1945 in Vilanculos in what was then Portuguese East Africa. If you imagine today's Mozambique, it's about a third of the way up the coast. Her family encouraged her to go to school, which wasn't the norm back then. And she managed to go as far as attending secondary school in the capital Lourenço Marques, which is today's Maputo.
Interesting. So what then happened?
Well, there, Josina became politically active in clandestine student groups. She became an underground member of the Frelimo independence movement and decided to join the liberation war against the Portuguese. But to do this, you actually had to travel to Tanzania, where Frelimo had bases. But
what?
That was kind of hard. First, you actually had to escape the Portuguese colonial police, and you also had to avoid South Africa, where apartheid agents at the time were more than willing to hand over Frelimo recruits to the Portuguese colonial authorities, which you definitely did not want. So anyway, Josina Machel, in order to reach the Frelimo bases in Tanzania, she had to engage in a 3,500-kilometer trek, not once, but twice.
Dumbo Mozambique, Dumbo Mozambique, Dumbo Mozambique, Maputukezi musha, pera kutiza uno Mozambique, Dumbo Mozambique.
And basically by whichever means necessary. The first time she was caught and jailed, but she was released 5 months later, and then she embarked on the second journey that took her to Swaziland, which is today's Eswatini, Johannesburg in South Africa, through Botswana, Zambia, and finally she got to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania.
You know, Kai, I think it was a couple months ago, I went on a walk with my brother, 10 kilometers, just 10 kilometers, and I had blisters all over my feet, you know, so 7,000 kilometers mostly on foot and months of jail time as well. That does sound like one hell of a trip.
Well, also, under constant danger. And remember, she was just 18 years old at this time.
Wow.
The sad thing is that she would actually never see her family again after this journey. But according to Mozambican historian Egidio Vaz, she wasn't the only Mozambican who made this extreme journey in search of freedom.
The escape of Josina and so many others to engage in the liberation war was not something unique. I think that anyone living under those political, social and economic conditions felt they had to do something. Each generation faces a challenge, and Josina and her generation understood that they were ready proceeding with national liberation.
Naquelas condições estavam preparados para avançar ao processo de libertação nacional.
Fair enough, I can understand that. Better to die for something than to live for nothing, or what's that saying again?
Live on your feet, then die on your knees. No. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, something like
anyway.
that.
Something like that. What made Josina different, though, was her absolute dedication to Mozambique's war of liberation. This was a warrior through and through, and she never wanted to leave the fight. According to Professor Isabel Casimiro from Mozambique's Eduardo Mondlane University.
Quando ela já está na Frelimo em 1965, começa a participar.
When she joined Frelimo in 1965, she trained with the Women's Detachment. In 1967, Frelimo offered her a scholarship to continue her studies in Switzerland, but she rejected the offer, believing the best way to keep track of the war was to be closely involved with it.
A forma de acompanhar o desenvolvimento da luta era vivendo perto os acontecimentos.
But Leila, another remarkable thing about Josina, and something that she's also famous for, was her almost personal example of why women should be allowed to fight in the liberation war. While many movements fought for ideals, freedom, and equality, few actually had much to say about the role of women in the liberation struggle at the time.
Honestly, Kai, I do get what you're saying, and I do see that, that push for liberation that she drove. But what is it that she did?
So Frelimo was an exception to this, patriarchal way of fighting the liberation. Josina became the driving force behind Frelimo's Women's Detachment. It was a unit where women undertook combat training and political education. Josina, along with 24 other women, trained in guerrilla warfare. She rose through Frelimo's ranks, becoming the head of Frelimo's Department of Social Affairs in 1969. And guess what? She was only 24 years old at this time.
E ela própria foi uma mulher que se envolveu
She was mainly
muito,
involved in social tasks related to women and children. She was engaged in founding orphanages, firstly in Niassa province and then in northern Mozambique. She stands out for her hard work in training women, in mobilizing them, and for her work for national unity.
Também porque ela trabalhou muito na mobilização das mulheres, na formação das mulheres, em questões de unidade nacional.
That was Casemiro again.
This is very inspiring, honestly. And how did Josina become Josina Machel? I think we kind of touched on this at the beginning, but what's that story around the marriage?
Yeah, so in 1969, Josina married Samora Machel, who she met at a training center she helped develop in southern Tanzania. And the couple actually had a son called Samito.
Kai, knowing what I know about women's oppression today and obviously what it must have been like 5-6 decades ago, how was Josina able to successfully get women involved in this?
Well, she campaigned and actually appealed to the mothers to let their children study in Frelimo's education centers. You have to remember that many Mozambicans actually left the Portuguese colony to seek freedom in Tanzania. So there were plenty of displaced Mozambicans around. And here is an excerpt of one of the few speeches we have left of Josina Machel, speaking in a then liberated zone of northern Mozambique.
Frelimo has a great responsibility upon the education of these children because we know they will continue our fight. These children study not for them or their moms, but to serve the country development in this moment of fight and also after the independence.
Sadly, though, Josina Machel was diagnosed with liver cancer and became too sick to fight. Still, she worked tirelessly to build a new society, says Mozambican historian Egidio Vaz.
Para mim, se fosse para definir o que é Josina, Josina é igual ao trabalho.
I were to define Josina, it would be through work, selfless work. It wasn't about what she could get out of it, but rather about the people, saving lives and building a society that is unified, that has solidarity, that promotes mutual help.
Solidária, de promoção de interajuda.
Wow. And all of this before she was 25?
Yes, tragically, Josina succumbed to cancer in 1971, aged 25, and never to see her country liberated from the Portuguese. Her widower, Samora Machel, went on to become the first president of an independent Mozambique in 1975. And the date of Josina's death, the 7th of April, is celebrated today as Women's Day in Mozambique.
Very fitting, I must say.
And for me, the thing about Josina Machel, it's just amazing that somebody could do the things she did and have such a strong conviction at the age of 25. I mean, she lived more in those years than many of us live in our entire lives.
Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umodzi.
Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umodzi.
Olimba moyo.
Olimba moyo. Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umodzi. Olimba moyo. Olimba moyo. Tiende pamozi ndi mtima umodzi.
When we come back, we'll meet a Tanzanian heroine who was cast off by those she helped bring to power.
DW African Roots. Find new African Roots episodes on dw.com/African Roots, Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Leila, we're staying in Tanzania, you say?
Staying in Tanzania, but not talking about a Mozambican. We are talking about another independence heroine, Kai, who was a contemporary of Josina Machel's, but one who had a very different fate.
Okay, so who are we talking about?
This one is not really well known, at least on a Pan-African scale. Her name is Bibi Titi Mohammed.
I've certainly not heard about her, so I guess you're right about that.
Okay, so I'll start at the beginning. 1926, Kai, is when she was born in Dar es Salaam, the biggest city in the British colony of Tanganyika in East Africa, today's Tanzania. She was born into a very conservative family, with her father allegedly refusing to send her to school because it clashed with his interpretation of Islam. It was only when he died, Kai, that Mohammed was sent to school.
Well, that was obviously very different to Josina Machel, and I can see that was not an advantageous start in life, I guess.
Exactly, Kai. You know, well, she was then married off to an older man, and this was just at the tender age of 14, okay? I guess it was quite common at the time, but Mohammed was a very lively person and aspired to much more than a life confined to the household. One of the things she did was she was involved in Ngomas.
Sorry? What is an Ngoma?
Good question. Well, basically, they are dance groups, okay, that are still famous today in East Africa and the Great Lakes region. Normally, they signify some important event or ritual, for example, a wedding or a coming-of-age ceremony, let's say. Now, traditional Ngomas were actually banned during colonial times. The loud noises, drums, and dancing were apparently a nightmare to colonial administrators because A, the Ngomas were, they brought people together, and B, they represented the complete opposite of the West's so-called civilizing mission.
Okay, so these Ngomas, why were they particularly important to Bibi Mohammed?
Well, she loved to dance and she loved being involved with these Ngomas. And cleverly, the Ngomas incorporated colonial dresses and Western instruments into their routines, right? Which made them more, shall we say, palatable to the colonial authorities. Historian Francis Dowd of the Mwalimu Nyerere Memorial Academy explains how this was Bibi Mohammed's introduction to politics.
What made her to join politics, she could not get a formal education, but she joined what we call it these traditional dances. And those traditional dances were the one which exposed him and gave her a connection with political wings. So she later met President Nyerere. By then, he was a leader of African nationalism in 1954. And Mwalimu was very impressed by courage and determination which shown by Bibi Titi Mohammed.
Remember, Dar es Salaam was the hub for a pro-independence movement. And one of the people around at the time was future leader Julius Nyerere, who would play a massive role, Kai, in Mohammed's life.
But Leila, these Ngomas, surely the colonial authorities must have realized something was up, right?
Yeah, so about that, women's groups were seen as apolitical by the colonial authorities and largely ignored. And Bibi Mohammed showed a stunning ability to mobilize women, Kai, particularly due to her involvement with women dance groups. Now, Nyerere saw her potential to mobilize the masses, and he made her the leader of the Union for Women of Tanganyika. Within 3 months, she had managed to enroll more than 5,000 women as members.
Wow.
Yeah. She reached her political pinnacle when she was appointed as Minister for Women and Social Affairs following Tanganyika's independence in 1961. More importantly, though, her activities helped to raise the profile of women's participation in national politics. Some even referred to her as the mother of the nation. However...
Okay, but this was going so well.
I know, but, we have to get to that point. So... she clashed with President Nyerere's plan for African socialism. Nyerere made Tanzania a one-party state, and, he had an authoritarian streak. And from what I learn about how outspoken Mohammed was, she wasn't into taking anything lying down.
Okay, so what happened?
In 1969, which was the same year that Josina Machel was marrying Samora Machel, by the way, in another part of Tanzania, Bibi Mohammed and Minister of Labor Michael Kamaliza were charged with plotting to overthrow the government, okay? Now, this came after anti-government protests, and she was accused of instigating them. After a long trial, a very long trial, she was later found guilty and handed a life sentence. Now, how well-founded these charges were, we'll never know for sure, okay? But what is certain is that her reputation and her political standing was shot.
We, as a historian, we consider her as the symbol of women participation during liberation movement in Tanzania. In historical writings, actually, we have been forgetting the place or the role which played by women. So when we try to teach maybe students at higher learning institutions about the liberation struggle, we are using the name of Bibi Titi Mohammed as the symbol of how women participated.
That was historian Dawood, and he believes Bibi Titi Mohammed's story needs to be retold.
Oh, but Leila, I don't get it though. If she was such an important figure, was there ever some sort of recognition for her work?
Well, sort of. She was released early from prison in 1977 after receiving a presidential pardon. But by then her political star had dimmed, I must say, as friends and even her own husband abandoned her. There was some recognition. That was when Tanzania celebrated 30 years of independence in 1991, and the ruling party singled her out as a heroine of the freedom struggle. But Mohammed never returned to politics. She was done, and she lived a low-profile life, and eventually died in South Africa in November 2000.
Wow, that is kind of sad. A quiet end to somebody who had such a big impact on the women's movement in politics in Tanzania.
I know, right? And, it's a bit of an anti-climax for a liberation hero who arguably created the women's political movement in Tanzania. But there have been some efforts made to recognize Bibi Titi Mohammed in today's Tanzania. In Dar es Salaam, for instance, the nation's bustling commercial capital,
Bibi Titi, Bibi Titi, Bibi Titi, Bibi Titi.
an important downtown street near the harbor is named after her. And our reporter, Frederick Nwaka, found out that young Tanzanians do in fact know about Bibi Titi Mohammed.
For what I know, she was the main advisor of Mwalimu Nyerere. She advised him in a lot of things, like she once advised him to learn fluent Swahili so as to have a good communication with Tanganyikan people.
About her legacy, I can say it can be traced back in her own life history, as she was imprisoned, though later on she was released. We are currently witnessing different female politicians like Halima Mdee and Esther Matiko, who we can say they are facing the same situation, but they are still strong female politicians.
But, still, in a way, I think both Josina Machel and Bibi Titi Mohammed have made a big impression on the independence movement in their respective countries. Can you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, while you could say that Josina Machel's life was tragically cut short, I'd argue the special brand of politics and activism that Mohammed brought to Tanzania as a fledgling country, reached far beyond her days as a politician. And I think that, since Nyerere's regime fell and the more controversial aspects of it became known, her influence as a trailblazer was finally recognized. That's where we'll have to leave things for today. African Roots is a cooperation between Deutsche Welle and the Gerda Henkel Foundation. Thanks to Comic Republic in Nigeria for the artwork. Special thanks to our producer, Philip Zadner, and our voiceover artists. Contributions as well by Gloria Sousa, Lionel Matias, Frederick Nwaka, and Gwen Hilson Lardner. I'm Leila Johnson Salami.
And I'm Kai Nebe.